Hello and welcome back. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we're going to be talking about institutions, specifically when you should be implementing each institution, but we'll also be covering which institutions I think are best. Before we can really get into this, we need to talk about bureaucracy in general, because bureaucracy is the resource you use to pay for institutions, and so it's necessary to talk about it. You have basically, for the most part, four main things you spend bureaucracy on, although you can spend it on events and journal entries as well. You will pay bureaucracy for all the pops in your incorporated states, just for the population, just to pay for the population, and you will also pay for bureaucracy for institutions in incorporated states. And so this is important to emphasize. Most of what you're paying for bureaucracy is going to be relative to your incorporated states. When you incorporate a state, you pay all the bureaucracy costs up front, and then you slowly gain access to all the benefits of your institutions, the main and most important one being taxation, with the exception of your consumption taxes will always apply even in unincorporated states, but all your other taxes will not apply. And so this is the main reason to want to incorporate states, and it is the main use of bureaucracy for incorporating states, or it's the main stuff you you put it in initially. So you're also going to be paying for trade routes and generals, and so as just a general heuristic to briefly cover, the larger your population, the less a cost relative to your total bureaucracy trade routes and generals are. So the bigger you are, the more generals and trade routes you can have, which is not too much of a shocker, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind, kind of keep in the back of your head. The second thing we need to talk about is how you get this resource, or where you get this resource. And you get it from government administrations, and there is a sort of little bit of a texture to do with government administrations in regards to throughput bonus, because a majority of the cost of your government institutions is in the wages, or not a majority in the wages, but a very large percentage is in the wages. Here, the wages aren't very high because we have an SOL of 9, so the normal wage is really low. The government wage cost is going to be the average wage, or the normal wage, of all your incorporated states. So whatever you're paying on average in incorporated states, this will be the wage of the government administration, unless you're juicing them up in the government wages section. Okay, so going back to this, generally speaking, a huge portion of what you will be paying is in the wages and not the goods themselves. We're paying a little bit more for the goods here. And so what this means is that throughput is really, really good, because throughput will increase the paper input, or also phones if you're on that, and it will increase the output by the same percentage as the throughput. So building bureaucratic administrations particularly tall is really good, and you will have certain phases in the game where you you have a level 35 and you just want to 51 it because it's going to be extremely efficient. And during these bumps, when you are getting max throughput from economies of scale in your bureaucratic administrations, this is often a time you want to put in institutions. And also, if you are not running a tax deficit, which we are definitely running here in several places, you will often want to just build up bureaucratic administrations in places where they can be tall. Okay. So this kind of brings us to kind of thinking about countries in two different ways in terms of when it comes to bureaucratic administration cost. You're going to have either a country that has a huge population of peasants, which we do here in Gili. We have a ton of peasants overall in all of our states except for the Mongol ones. And so we have a ton of population, and so while we are paying for the population for incorporated states, we are running insufficient taxation capacity as well at the same time. Generally speaking, for these really high population, high peasant countries, as far as institutions go, institutions are really expensive because of the high population involved in putting in on them, and so you generally want to avoid putting in a lot of institutions as a general heuristic. As you start to have fewer and fewer pops that are peasant, and you start to, just as soon as you have almost no pops that are peasants, you will start wanting more institutions, and likely all the institutions. And so it's a little bit of a rank order type thing in terms of which ones we're looking to enact first. But for the most part, if you have an enormous population, you're just gonna kind of want to go for colonization only and start adding the other stuff in a little bit slowly, because the other stuff is important, but this is just kind of a good heuristic. Okay. So, let's also just briefly cover the bureaucracy laws. Now, for this run, for whatever reason, all this is inverted for all the laws. So normally hereditary bureaucrats is on top. So don't be confused about the inversion of the location of these. I think this is a bug. I'm not sure. Hereditary bureaucrats gives minus 25% cost to the population cost modifier. So this will be okay on countries that have extremely high population. And if you start in a country with extremely high population with a lot of peasants, you want to be careful of moving to appointed bureaucrats, because it will cost a lot of bureaucracy, because you will no longer be getting this minus population cost modifier. So for example, if we swapped over to that, we would get minus 25% on this cost. So we would get a refund of about 500 bureaucracy if we switch to hereditary bureaucrats. Appointed bureaucrats gives plus taxation capacity. So right now we have insufficient taxation capacity in a few places. And so what this does is it gives us extra taxation capacity, so we are able to tax the pops more. When you are super early bare bones, hereditary bureaucrats can be good, but once you start getting a decent amount of bureaucracy, appointed bureaucrats is almost always better, even in the really high population, high peasant countries, especially as you start wanting to put in institutions. If you want to run 0 institutions in a really high pop, high peasant country, hereditary bureaucrats can be better, but you are paying the landowner negative penalty as well. Or this is generally perceived as negative because you don't want landowners to have political strength, and juicing the intelligentsia is decent. Late game, or relatively late game, the best law for bureaucracy is going to be elected bureaucrats, and the reason being is the minus 15% cost on institutions. If we take a look over here though, we currently have insufficient taxation capacity in a bunch of places. As long as you have a ton of insufficient taxation capacity, you're probably better off appointing bureaucrats. Once you start clearing that out, elected bureaucrats will get a lot better, because a huge chunk of what you're paying for with your bureaucracy will become the institutions. For the insufficient tax capacity, this is generally in the higher pop states. So if we take a look at our current state of affairs here, we will notice that we have, we are paying around 4x for our population than we are for our single institution, although we only have one institution. And so as this flips and you start playing a lion's share for institutions, then you will start wanting to switch to elected bureaucrats. So I think we can switch countries here and kind of illustrate that. Now Japan, we know, has a decent amount of institutions because we were playing on Japan before in this run. And we come in here and we see we have institution cost of 400, which is very similar because it's kind of similar population. It's a little bit lower, but we will notice it is much more even in terms of what we are paying for institutions relative to this. So whenever you're going to change your bureaucracy law, then this one's on elected bureaucrats, so it is making the institutions cheaper. It'd be roughly equivalent. When you start passing that sort of threshold, you want to think about changing those over. Okay, so now let's get into the institutions themselves and talk about which ones are best and when they're best. We're going to cover the 3 best ones first. It's difficult to really say which one's best because they're situationally going to be kind of different, but I think the most important institution is generally colonization. Your colonization speed is based on your incorporated pops. So the more incorporated pops you have, even if they're peasants, the better colonization gets. Roughly speaking, I think colonial exploitation is best because this throughput bonus in unincorporated states, but resettlement's a lot better now in 1.2. And so colonization is going to be extremely important, and it's going to be especially good in the low pop, high peasant states. And I think it might be one of the few that is extremely good in the high pop, high peasant countries. It's going to be extremely good, and it's the only one that is like especially good. Next up, we have internal security, in particular talking about guaranteed liberties. These are in the correct locations, which is a bit nicer. Which is going to give you radicals and loyalist kind of juices. It's going to give it based on the level. This institution is extremely good for harvesting bonuses from your interest groups, because if you have a ton of loyalists, you will get a bunch of approval juice based on the proportion of loyalists that you have. And this, if you can get it above 10, you will start to get bonuses from your interest groups, and we're not going to get too much into that, but these are quite strong, which makes guaranteed libs particularly good, especially if so this is from standard of living's increase. So you're going to need to have a growing standard of living for this to be good. It generally is hard for a country with a lot of peasants to have a growing standard of living, because you're just pulling the peasants out from their equilibrium threshold. You notice there's a lot of peasants in Japan, so this line's not going up too much. So guaranteed liberties is only going to be particularly good if your standard of living is rising, which is not going to be the case in the high peasant states in general. But other than that, guaranteed liberties is extremely good, and so this is kind of a way to think about it. And education is just kind of going to always be good. If you are in the high pop, high peasant state, it is going to be hard for you to have a really high wealth, and so it is better to have public schools. If you can manage to have a high standard of living, private schools will be better, and the intelligentsia political strength juice is something that you might want to be interested in. Religious schools, I think, is generally not very good, except for it is easy to put in kind of early. And then a quick thing to note is the Mosque of Jinneh, the unique building over here in Messina, who they never build if it's the AI, but it's in eastern Mali. What this will do is it will give you 20% education access. Just thought I should briefly mention that. So back over here. These are the 3 best institutions in a general sense, and are probably the first 3 you're going to want to put in if you can, but we're going to talk about the other ones and when they are good and this type of stuff. Health system is going to be a little bit... So health system is going to help you save the pops that you already have, because it's going to decrease mortality. In particular, private health insurance is going to be best, when you have a really high standard of living, and public health insurance is going to be best when you don't. In general, I think passing private health insurance, one reason to do this, and this is a reason to do any institution, it's kind of good for making the industrialists happy. And so we talked a little bit about bonuses. If you are a little bit off from getting one of the bonuses, sometimes you want to just pass a law that's going to make them happy, and private health insurance can be one of those laws. It's going to be expensive to do that, though, so you are going to generally not want to put a health institution in a really high peasant population. And so this is one thing. This is kind of like thing 1. But if you have a really high population without a lot of peasants, which is kind of a late game phenomena, health insurance becomes extremely good. So this is more of a late game institution in terms of when it's good. But if you have a really low population, and you have a decent standard of living, and you have almost no peasants, the cost of the institution is going to be extremely low, and then you sometimes want to pass health systems or health insurance just to kind of make your IGs happier. In general, I think no one opposes private health insurance, so this is going to make the industrialists a little happier for you permanently, and so private health insurance becomes a good option for this specifically. And since, you're not really looking to... If you have an enormous population and a ton of peasants, you're not really looking to put in health insurance anyways. Public health insurance, this is where it would be particularly good, is not particularly good. So, private health insurance. Next up, we have labor rights. And labor rights is an interesting one. So first of all, you want to abolish serfdom as quickly as possible, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the institution of regulatory bodies and workers' protection. In general, workers' protections can be okay if you have just level 1 or 2, but the minimum wage, increasing that up and up and up, is going to wreck your economy most of the times. So that's generally you want to avoid workers' protections and prefer regulatory bodies, because both give minus dangerous working conditions. The time you want to put this in is when when the trade unions start to become powerful, because they have extremely good IG bonuses. And this is going to be kind of a decent one no matter what. They have really good bonuses in solidarity, workforce ratio, and also manufacturing industry's throughput, which is extremely strong. So once they become powerful, in particularly above 20%, but also once they become above 5%, you're going to want to think about passing regulatory bodies, mainly to make them happy. This will make them a little bit happy, and it'll make the industrialists a little unhappy, and you're probably going to want to pass it at a time when it doesn't make the industrialists unhappy and it makes these guys happy. Again, you're not going to want to generally pass this in the really high population, high peasant states, but once you have a high population, and you don't have a lot of peasants, regulatory bodies becomes extremely good, because you kind of enter a phase in the game when if you are siphoning a lot of pops from migration, if your population is relatively low, and you're getting a ton of population growth from migration, you really don't care if your pops die. or you don't really care too much. But once you have a large population itself, your pop's mortality becomes more important. And this also applies to kind of the consideration with health system. Once your population is really large, the mortality becomes more important, and so you can pass these. There's also negative event chains for not having regulatory bodies or workers' protections. And so generally, if you get this negative event chain, the workers strike, you just promise to pass regulatory bodies, and then you pass it, and this is kind of a good way of looking at things. But this is never an institution to really rush, especially other than maybe if you want to pick up the bonus, then it just kind of feels free maybe putting it in, but overall not that strong an institution, so it's not going to be much of a priority. Last up, we have Social Security. Again, this has another one that is kind of one where you pass it to make the industrialists happy, but you can also pass it to keep the industrialists strong, or work towards old age pension to make the trade unionists stronger and the peasants stronger, this type of thing. And so this is an interesting one that you are usually passing with a sort of sensitivity to the clout levels in your government and trying to massage this in a particular direction. And this is when this is kind of good. As an institution itself, it's not especially good, the welfare. It's like kind of good in sometimes and it's kind of bad sometimes. And so overall, I think it's just slightly net positive, and this is the last institution you really care about passing. But what you can do is you can pass poor laws, and the industrialists will endorse this, and so this can be a way to make the industrialists happy. And so usually you might want to leave it off for passing at that point. And the wage transitioning from poor laws to wage subsidies to old age pension will always make the trade unionists happy, and so you can do this to try and get them to be happy and to try and harvest their bonus. And so this is kind of a use for it. In particular, old age pension I think is overall best in a vacuum, but poor laws is often going to be best because the people who oppose it are just the landowners, and so it'll be easiest to keep IGs happy, and so sometimes you just pass poor laws to just stay on IGs being happy. Notably, it is going to get minus political strength when receiving welfare, and so this is the modifier, and this one gives kind of the reverse of that, which is dependent enfranchisement, so the dependents get some votes. And so if you're particularly trying to get, usually it is hard to get the rural folk powerful, but if you're trying to get the rural folk powerful, this is going to help the old age pension. But also dependents income I think is a positive modifier. Workforce ratio is a bad modifier. Overall, I think the dependents income is good, especially if you have a really, really large consumer base. If you have a really large population, dependents income will be especially good because it will help drive demand in your economy and increase the profitability of everything. And it is worth the negative workforce ratio. Overall, you keep this institution on level 1 or 2 most of the time, in my opinion. And so it's not a priority to pass, again, but it is one that you want to occasionally put in for IG approval reasons. Like, for example, if you know that you're going to pass, let's take a look. If you know you're going to pass compulsory primary school and you're going to upset the industrialists, right? Something you can do to offset it, to try and make it sure you're still getting the bonus, is put in... Where was the last one? Put in poor laws, right? Because the industrialists like poor laws, and since you know you're about to upset them, you can make them a little bit happier with decaying bonus. And so for, for all of labor rights, the regulatory bodies and welfare, poor laws, wage subsidies, etc., as well as to some extent the health system, all these are going to be more sensitive to the fact that you are caring about IG approval rating than anything else. In particular, they will be really bad if you have a lot of peasants, because the institutions in general will be really expensive, and so you want to kind of keep off of it. And so there's this. The last one that we need to talk about is law enforcement, which we haven't quite talked about yet. And law enforcement is a weird one because it gives the bonus it gives is either really, really good or really, really bad. It gives minus radicals from standard living decreases. Generally, you want your standard of living to kind of always be floating up slightly, so this aspect of it's not going to be particularly useful. The second is minus state penalties from turmoil. I think dedicated police force is the best, by the way, but we'll jump into that afterwards, and we'll talk about that afterwards. The minus state penalties from turmoil. In general, when you conquer a state, you get turmoil. We can switch back to Gili to talk about this. When you conquer a state, you will get a bunch of turmoil, right? And the turmoil has a bunch of negative penalties. Of them, migration attraction, tax waste, and state construction efficiency. These are particularly nasty. Now, it'd be great if we could just decrease these. So law enforcement becomes particularly good. Keep in mind these are inversed because we're playing on Xi now for whatever reason. I have no idea why it's like this. But dedicated police force is going to give you minus state penalties for turmoil. Unfortunately, only incorporated states gain access to this. So it is often when you conquer a state is not incorporated, and so you can't really apply your law enforcement bonus to them unless you are conquering states. If you're conquering a lot of states that you can incorporate in 5 years or less, dedicated police force is extremely strong and is one of the best. If you are not doing this, it's kind of meh. It's not terrible, and it becomes good in a particular of a situation when you have a lot of radicalism, and the radicalism is driving up turmoil, which is kind of not so much the case here. We have turmoil from conquering stuff, but if you have a lot of radicalism from turmoil, then this becomes a good institution. But other than that, it's not really that good an institution, and you just generally don't want to. You want to kind of pass dedicated police force and just like leave it on a low level and not really increase it. Or you could stay on no police, in particular if you have a really high population with really low peasants. So if you start as Great Qing, you probably don't want to pass police force, but in this situation where we're playing as Xi Li and we are conquering other Chinese states, we definitely want it because we are picking up these Chinese states and they're going to have a ton of turmoil, and minusing the effect of this turmoil is going to be really, really, really useful. Okay? Let's just briefly talk about, which ones of these are best, and kind of, I think dedicated police force is just generally the best. Local police force does give the best modifier in terms of minus state penalties from turmoil, and so if you're conquering a ton of states that you can incorporate in 5 years or less, you can think about doing local police force. It does juice the landowners a little bit, but it's actually a decent one in the particular case when you are going to be incorporating places that just have enormous turmoil. And in Jili particularly, we could even think about this one. Also in our Sokoto run, where all the African sub-Saharan states are incorporatable in 5 years, this would have also been a good look. But for the most part, it's not very good because you don't want to juice the landowners by 10%. The final one is militarized police force, which has a more distinct situation regarding radicals. It also gives, so just very quickly, it gives the bonuses that dedicated police force gives. And then also what you get is -5 radicals from discrimination, increased mortality per turmoil, and armed forces political strength. Overall, I think that this is negative, but if you are intentionally running a high discrimination country, you can think about doing this, especially if the discrimination is causing enough radicals that you are starting to get a lot of turmoil just from the radicals. Then you can think about militarized police force. The plus 10% armed forces political strength I think is kind of a bit of a nothing burger, but it does make it harder for you to try and hit a balance of having the trade unionists, intelligentsia, industrialists all powerful simultaneously, which is kind of the ideal situation. But other than that, police force, very situational. So we're just going to run through all the institutions real quick. The 3 best institutions are going to be colonization, internal security, specifically guaranteed liberties, and I don't think it's particularly close. National Guard does give you more conscripts, but I don't think this is, sometimes it's okay, but other than that, the internal security is going to be better. And also, education is going to be good, because it kind of helps you develop literacy a little bit. Okay. So these 3 are the best. In particular, public schools or schools in general, or public schools is going to be better when you have a lot of peasants. Private schools is going to be better when you have no peasants. Guaranteed liberties is going to be generally better if you can constantly be increasing SOL, which is difficult when you have a lot of peasants. So if you are at a high peasant, high population country, probably not worth passing guaranteed libs very early. Colonization is the only institution that is extremely good when you have a lot of population when they are peasants, because colonization speed is based on your incorporated population, the number of your incorporated population, so it's going to be extremely strong in high population states. And so colonization is one that is, if you're going to pay for just one institution in like China, for example, it would be colonization, probably followed by education. Next up, we have kind of a flight of several institutions that are particularly good for just massaging IG approval rating, and are also situationally good. As you become a really rich country, you want all the institutions, but these are kind of the less of priority ones, and those are health system, regulatory bodies. Both of these decrease the amount of people who are dying. If you are getting most of your pops from migration, this is not important. Once you have a really large population size, these become more important, and this is kind of the good way to evaluate it. If your population is just like straight vertical from migration, basically, you really don't care about these at all. And if it's not, then you care a lot. Although usually, if you have a lot of migration, you can also afford to put the institutions in because you have a relatively low population, and your institution cost, bureaucracy cost per level is probably going to be low. The last one that is kind of in the same group is going to be welfare in general. You're passing this to massage IG clout and approval. The wage subsidies will generally make the industrialist and anyone who has a lot of money more powerful in terms of clout, and the no social security will make the people who don't have a lot of money more powerful in terms of clout, because it juices up the clout, or sorry, allow me to come back to this. Poor laws, this being inverted messed me up. Poor laws in particular will help juice the industrialists, particularly. They approve of it. No one disapproves of poor laws, or the landowners only disapprove of poor laws, but in general, passing poor laws is going to be rather nice for IG approval rating, because people are just generally a fan of it. If we take a look, we see the trade unionists and the industrialists both endorse it. So poor laws is going to be the best for just approval straight up, and it is going to juice the clout. Wage subsidies is kind of in between old age pension. Old age pension, the actual effects of it, I think, are the best, and it will give dependent enfranchisement, which means that dependents seem to be primarily like rural folk and trade unions, so it will juice these, and it will also give minus workforce ratio and dependents income, which is going to be good overall, but it will decrease workforce ratio. In particular, if you're stacking a lot of positive workforce ratio, it is more of a good thing than if you don't have any workforce ratio bonuses. And finally, the last institution to talk about is policing, which is not very good overall, but then becomes extremely good if you are expanding a lot, particularly conquering states that you have a short incorporation turnaround. The reason being, states that you conquer are going to have a large amount of turmoil. Turmoil is a really negative modifier, and even the problem with policing is it only applies to incorporated states. This is the problem with all of your institutions. They only apply to incorporated states. So very often, if you conquer something and it has a 20-year incorporation, like this does here, it's going to be, you're not going to ever really get the effect of the police, because you're going to be able to get rid of like the radicals before then, and so it's not going to be useful if you're on a 20-year incorporation, but it will be very useful if you're on a 5-year incorporation, like we are here, or were here, because we've already incorporated, and then police will become extremely good. And so police is the most situationally polarized in terms of its usefulness. Often just passing dedicated police force and leaving it on level 1, and just passing this whenever it's convenient, will be decent. Decrease radicals from standard living decreases is not like a nothing burger of a modifier, but if you want to stay on no police for a really long time, and you are situationally not conquering a lot of states that in particular you can incorporate in 5 years, it's no police is okay. Anyways, hope this guide was helpful. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm things. This tutorial was based on kind of like a request for information, and so if there's any tutorials in particular people are interested in, feel free to put them in the comments below, and have a good day.